Behind any commercial flight is more than a century of political negotiation and accords that dictate who, how, and where airlines can fly. Aviation is one of the most unifying industries worldwide because it is what brings the world together. The beginning of aviation agreements came with the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. This convention established the UN oversight agency responsible for civil aviation, the International Civil Aviation Organization. The ICAO is recognized by every country worldwide except for Liechtenstein, Dominica, and Tuvalu. Of those, Tuvalu is the sole country to have an international airport, so that means that all but one sky-faring nation worldwide is part of the ICAO. Soon after its inception, the ICAO laid out 5 fundamental rights of aviation, known as the 5 freedoms of the air, which serve as a framework for international aviation agreements. Each freedom has varying levels of acceptance, but every developed country worldwide grants these rights to certain foreign airlines. The first freedom of the air is the right to fly over a foreign country without landing. Pretty much every commercial flight and commercial airline is allowed to do this. There are exceptions. The EU has a list of hundreds supposedly unsafe airlines that are not allowed in EU airspace, but there are no large airlines today restricted from certain airspace. It may seem like a given that foreign airlines can overfly countries, but the airspace above a country is sovereign territory of that country, more or less. There isn't actually an internationally recognized line of separation between sovereign airspace and space. Some say it's 19 miles above sea level, the highest altitude balloons and airplanes can fly, while others say it's as high as 99 miles, the altitude of the lowest stable orbits around Earth. The US classifies anyone who's flown 50 miles or higher above Earth as an astronaut, so that therefore means that the US recognizes 50 miles above Earth as the beginning of space. However, there are instances in which the US hasn't respected sovereignty below 50 miles. When space shuttle missions returned to Earth, they did so much like an airplane, with a slow horizontal descent down to a runway. Their descent paths were so long that they had to descend over foreign nations, such as Canada, below 50 miles altitude. And yet the US never requested permission from Canada to fly in their airspace. Just because airlines are allowed to fly over foreign countries doesn't mean that they can do so without restriction. Of course they need to be in contact with air traffic control, but they also need to pay what's known as overflight fees. Overflight fees are how airlines pay foreign countries they fly over but don't land or take off in for the use of their air traffic control services. Airlines still have to pay to use air traffic control in countries they land or take off in, but these fees are paid and calculated in different ways depending on the country. Overflight fees are nearly universal. The US, for example, charges $56.86 per 100 nautical miles. You may think that these fees are fairly inconsequential, since the only international flights that really fly over the US without landing are flights to, from, or between Mexico, Canada, and some Caribbean nations. However, the US is actually responsible for a huge amount of airspace, way larger than the US itself. It was allocated this airspace by the International Civil Aviation Organization, and since it provides air traffic control for this area, it also charges overflight fees. This does mean, weirdly, that flights from Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and other Melanesian countries pay overflight fees to the US when flying to Northeast Asian destinations such as Japan, Korea, and China. In US oceanic airspace, however, airlines only pay $21.63 per 100 nautical miles. It may seem like these small charges would have little effect, but on long-haul flights, overflight fees can really add up. Especially with the razor-thin airline margins that you learned about in my Why Flying is So Expensive video, airlines do have to put consideration into where they fly based on overflight fees. Canadian overflight fees are notoriously expensive. They work on a variable cost structure based on takeoff weight and distance flown, so I won't go into actual numbers. Almost any flight originating in the US has to fly through expensive Canadian airspace en route to Europe, as you learned about in my video about the North Atlantic tracks. But airlines do have strategies to lower these costs. The most efficient route between San Francisco and Frankfurt goes north through Montana, up over northeast Canada, then across Greenland, Iceland, and down into Europe. However, airlines don't always use this route. On certain days with certain wind and weather conditions, they'll fly east through the United States, then enter Canadian airspace somewhere over Minneapolis or Chicago, so that they'll pay less in Canadian overflight fees. Complicated route planning software takes all the variables, weight, weather, overflight fees, etc., and figures out which route is most financially efficient, even if it wastes time or fuel. Moving on, the second freedom of the air is the right for airlines to land in foreign countries for technical stops. Essentially, that means refueling. Modern airplanes have ranges of up to 9,000 miles, so there's little need anymore for refueling stops. But in the past, they were crucial for long-haul flights. Shannon Airport in Western Ireland once received hundreds of flights per day, despite being located in an exceptionally rural area. The nearest large city to Shannon, Limerick, has a population of less than 100,000. But geographically, Shannon Airport is the nearest airport to the US. So back when airplanes had shorter ranges, they'd make a stop to refuel in Shannon before continuing on to their continental European destinations. During the era of the Soviet Union, almost no airline had permission to overfly the USSR, so airlines had to literally go the other way around the Earth. Nearly every flight between Europe and Asia was routed with a technical stop in Anchorage, Alaska to refuel. Obviously, this was incredibly inefficient. Today's direct Europe-Asia flights take between 10 and 12 hours, but back when they stopped in Anchorage, they took as many as 22 hours. Despite the huge range of airplanes today, there are still some flights that require refueling stops. Australia and New Zealand are almost exactly on the opposite side of the world from London, so any flight between the two places has to make a stop somewhere. On its London-Sydney flights, Qantas Airlines makes a stop in Dubai, and on flights between London and Auckland, Air New Zealand stops in Los Angeles. It is expected, however, that within weeks or days of this video going up, Qantas Airlines will announce a new direct route between Perth in Western Australia and London with their 787-900 Dreamliners, which would be the first direct commercial service in history between Europe and Australia. This 9,000-mile trek would take an immense 18 hours to connect the two continents. The third freedom of the air is pretty simple. It's the right to fly commercially from one's own country to another country. This is just like Air France flying Paris to New York or Singapore Airlines flying Singapore to Dubai. Almost every international airline is granted this third freedom. The fourth freedom is just the inverse of this, the right to fly commercially from another country to one's own. There are really no instances where the third and fourth freedoms are granted separately. If an airline is allowed to fly somewhere, they're also allowed to fly back with passengers. The fifth and final official freedom is the right for an airline to fly passengers between two foreign countries on a flight originating or terminating in their own country. Now, this is very similar to the second freedom, and the second freedom and fifth freedoms are often, but not always, granted together. With the second freedom, Qantas is allowed to stop in Dubai to refuel, but if they're granted the fifth freedom, Qantas is also allowed to pick up new paying passengers in Dubai and fly them to London. Some examples of this freedom include Air India's New York, London, Hyderabad route, which is allowed to fly passengers between New York and London, Cathay Pacific's Hong Kong, Vancouver, New York route, which is allowed to fly passengers between Vancouver and New York, and Ethiopian Airlines Addis Ababa, Dublin, Los Angeles flight, which is allowed to fly passengers between Los Angeles and Dublin. But let's move on to the sixth freedom. It may seem a little strange that there's a sixth freedom in the 5 freedoms of aviation. There are actually 9 total freedoms, but only the first 5 are recognized officially in the ICAO's 5 Freedoms Treaty. While freedoms 6 through 9 are widely accepted, they are not as universal, except for number 6. The sixth freedom is actually unbelievably common. It's the right for an airline to transport passengers from one foreign country to another via their own country. This is just like Air France taking passengers from New York to Dubai via Paris, or Korean Airlines taking passengers from Frankfurt to Tokyo via Seoul. As you can tell, having 6 freedom rights is basically a fancy way to say airlines are allowed to connect passengers. There are whole airlines that operate almost exclusively using 6 freedom rights. WOW Airlines and Icelandair take passengers from North America to Europe via Reykjavik, and Turkish, Qatar, Etihad, and Emirates Airlines take passengers mostly between Europe, Africa, and Asia via their Middle Eastern hubs. While each of these airlines do have some passengers only taking a direct flight to their hub, the vast majority of their traffic is connecting due to their geographic positions between population centers. I'll finish off by grouping the 7th, 8th, and 9th freedoms together, as you'll see they're quite similar and often come together. The 7th freedom allows an airline to fly between two foreign nations without connecting on to its home. The 8th freedom is the right for an airline to fly between two cities in one foreign country while continuing on to its own country. And the 9th and final freedom is the right for a foreign airline to fly between 2 points in a foreign country without continuing on to its own country. It's extremely rare for these freedoms to be granted, except for in the European Union. You see, the European Union has a single aviation market, meaning that any airline registered in an EU country is allowed to fly flights between, to, and from any airport in the EU. Budget airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet thrive on this regulation. Despite being an Irish airline, Ryanair is allowed to fly routes like Edinburgh to London, Paris to Lyon, and other domestic routes in foreign EU countries due to this single aviation market. There are almost no other instances where foreign airlines are allowed to fly domestic routes. Ryanair is also allowed to fly routes between two other EU countries, like Paris to Berlin, and from other EU countries to outside the EU, such as Barcelona to Fez, Morocco. This is also how Norwegian Airlines is allowed to fly long-haul from Sweden, Denmark, and the UK to the US. Well, more or less. You may recall that Norway is actually not part of the European Union, so they're not part of the EU's single aviation market. But interestingly, Norwegian Airlines is actually registered in Ireland, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and the UK in order to gain access to the EU's single aviation market, as well as the Open Skies Treaty that allows unlimited and unrestricted flights between the EU and the US. There's one really interesting use of these treaties and regulations in the form of short-haul flights between the Caribbean and the United States. Norwegian Airlines offers flights during the winter months from Boston, New York, and Baltimore to Martinique and Guadeloupe. And these aren't extensions to their long-haul flights using 5th Freedom rights. These are standalone flights in small airplanes. Boston and Baltimore don't even have Norwegian transatlantic flights. Normally a flight like this would never be allowed, but since Martinique is an overseas region and Guadeloupe is an overseas territory of France, they're also part of the EU's single aviation market and the Open Skies Treaty. So, those are the 5, or rather 9 freedoms of aviation. Aviation is a very politically charged and complicated subject, but these freedoms do a great job of simplifying and standardizing airline regulations worldwide.